Welcome to Following the Chosen with me, Ben McKecken, and hello, Laura Bennett.
Hello, Ben McKecken.
Before we get into this big finale, Laura, we've been a bit remiss, I think, in recent conversations, not thanking you for getting involved in the conversation that we're having. We're too engrossed in our own conversation to say thank you for you getting involved as well. Got some great comments coming on YouTube, which you can continue to slot just below where you're watching this. We've got to thank Sam K. James.
Yay.
Yeah, thank you for discussing with us in the last couple of episodes how you have enjoyed this conversation. Maybe we're just sharing this because you agree with us and have enjoyed the conversation. That's great. And also, I wanted to thank Claudia, who got in touch on YouTube to say on the last discussion we had, great talk, loves listening to us. Okay, terrific. The families in the beginning of the episode are celebrating Purim, a Jewish festival where the book of Esther is read. This is one of those moments, Laura, and we've been doing this throughout our Following the Chosen conversations where we get to our chat and we realize didn't do enough of our research and we didn't actually realize that was Purim. We talked about that in the episode, how we had no idea.
I don't know if it's like you're not necessarily not doing your research. You're just learning that there's all of these amazing cultural traditions that we're not aware of, right? It makes me want to understand more about the Jewish practice and more about that side of scripture and history that we don't necessarily always consider when we're approaching our Christian faith.
So it makes you wonder about that. It makes me wonder about my research. And we also, I don't know how we can point this out, Laura, as delicately as we can. I'm trying to do this in all humility, but thank you to The Chosen, as in The Chosen, for commenting and saying you're enjoying the conversations we're having, which it's interesting, it's a bit meta now, following The Chosen, where we're following The Chosen, and The Chosen, I shouldn't say following us, but maybe they've been watching the last few conversations, and we don't always say positive stuff. It's pretty much glowing, but occasionally, wow,
you get a bit sassy.
So maybe they're sitting around in The Chosen office watching us, and they're like, I was going to find a better word than tearing apart our conversation about their episodes.
I think you might be overthinking this.
You think
just
so?
a bit. Yeah, just a bit.
I'll rein in the overthinking and get back to thinking about this latest episode, the finale, Sustenance. Where should we start? The end, the beginning?
I think we can start at the beginning
All
because
right,
it was very strong.
Yes,
I thought.
it was.
This is the episode that brings together so many of the different storylines we've, of course, seen over the series, and it takes you in pretty quick to Jesus still talking with his disciples, still talking.
But before we get to that, Laura, you've jumped over the pre-titles bit.
This is your favorite part. You go with the pre-titles.
I love this bit.
You go with pre-titles.
I thought you were okay, but I thought you. All right. It bookends this episode, though. You get this great flashback to King David in his court and Asaph, one of the writers of the Psalms, which plenty of people would know from reading the book of Psalms. Asaph presenting what we've come to know as Psalm 77. But I love how it's used at the start and at the end. And like has happened many times in The Chosen, where you get these great imaginings of, I wonder what happened, for example, when they wrote Psalms and were presenting them for the first time, and you get a choir of voices behind Asaph delivering this to David, but just trying to imagine King David hearing this for the first time, like many times in The Chosen. I'd never thought of that before, Laura. What was that like when the Psalms were first handed down, let alone how fitting they were at the time, and then in the events that were happening in Jesus' life, which brings us to what you were just discussing.
It ties it all together because you see Jesus dealing with what we saw in the last episode, people who are resistant to his message and starting to be stirred a little bit against what he and his disciples are doing.
And coming from all over the place.
That's right. That's what this initial sort of scene really sets up, where you've got people who are Jewish, who are Gentiles, and everything kind of in between. And they're all there with their different opinions, there with their different views of Jesus, different views of each other. First of all, what was really powerful, he gets his disciples to sit down, which just, what's the word? Like, it sort of calms the situation.
Yeah.
You know, if you're going to confront somebody, a more powerful stance would be to be standing up and kind of eye to eye with them. Whereas he goes, let's all sit down. And the disciples are a little bit hesitant to do that because they go, wait a minute, we're looking like idiots here.
It's so disarming, yet also makes you look also not just like idiots, but weak.
Yes, and they were really uncomfortable with that because one of the questions being asked by some of the other people outside of the disciples was, why should we be following what you say when your followers aren't necessarily getting it right? Like, they were critical of some of the behavior of the disciples. And so to see the disciples not be in a defensive stance, but in a listening, relaxed stance was really powerful. And then Jesus does the same with everybody else too. And I thought it's this weird lesson in how do we disagree in a positive way? And the two big things that Jesus brings up is listening. Like, he really says, let's listen. And that's a big part of it. And he gets everybody to sit down, which just diffuses the situation really powerfully. And then gradually over the course of this episode, you see a crowd kind of amass around them, and the conversation extends beyond that. And we get to what is a really powerful final scene in this episode, which we won't go into just yet.
But I think the chosen team get it right again of Jesus is commanding even when he's it's not really on the back foot, but he's not going on the front foot. Like you said, he's not attacking those who are trying to attack him. He's not trying to fight fire with fire, but there's a real command to him that makes sense, that when he says, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk and listen, the others, instead of like besieging them or jumping on them, they sit down and they start listening, and they listen. And he's doing that Jesus thing of raising more parables or questions than potential answers. There are some answers that arrive, but we often, when we talk about or imagine Jesus, what he was like, that to me seems like a great example of that's probably what he was like.
He had a gravitas in person. And it's good that you point out the way that he would answer questions with parables, because we know that about Jesus. And there's even a moment where someone asks a question and he launches into a parable, or he's like, I've got a story for you. And everyone goes, like, come on. But then you realize in those moments where Jesus does tell a story or share a parable, he is giving you an answer. He's just causing you to get to that answer through a different kind of thought pattern than what you're kind of expecting. And I think too, in this scene as well, you see that part of Jesus' nature where he was always, like, the Bible tells us that, God's ways are higher than our ways, right? And the way that Jesus interacts with people, he's constantly rising above the squabble or rising above the question and kind of getting to the heart of the issue, which is what he does with these guys. Like, the disciples have this, issue with how they're going to be perceived as weak. And then on the other side, people are squabbling over your culture does this and you have these rules and your religion and blah, blah. And it's like, Jesus is like, guys, that's not the conversation we're here to have. Like, let's consider what the actual gospel message is. What are we driving at beyond that? And also when it gets interrupted by someone who needs healing, like, he's constantly about the bigger picture, the sort of higher thought, and everybody else is getting caught up in the little mess and minutiae of life that isn't as significant as the heart of what Jesus is really trying to drive at.
The feeding of the multitude that we get to, though, I was just going to cut to that. Unless there's something else that stands out to you in the build-up to that.
We can cut to that. Go ahead.
Oh, please. Because I thought, for one, the fact that those who are making the chosen got real people, and they're chosen fans, right, who are the multitude being fed. But the fact you got thousands of actual people, not computer-generated avatars or whatever, real people, didn't make the whole thing, but went a long way towards it. Like, the scale of it's not quite Cecil B. DeMille from back in the 20s and 30s, but it's harking back to that of like the power of seeing that many people in the one place for real helps to lend to the realism of what we're watching, particularly when we go back to, this is a story, an account that is so familiar. Even if you haven't read the Gospels ever, you have probably heard about what Jesus does for this crowd. So to be able to see it, particularly if you're someone who's lived and breathed it through God's word, I found quite spectacular.
And I like how in this episode, in a few different ways, they tie together elements that take you on like a thought journey that you might not otherwise have been on. For instance, where the feeding of the 5,000 happens in relation to this issue happening in the Decapolis and the building up of resistance to Jesus, in relation to what they have created as a backstory for Simon and Eden and all these different pieces. And then you see where the feeding of the 5,000 would go within that. And it just, I think, allows it to carry a different kind of weight or give you a different sort of insight into how these, miracles after miracles after miracles that we see from Jesus would have really sat within the everyday lives. Like, it's not just these isolated, God did this and then he did that and then he did that. It's like there's stories that would have weaved together the moment-to-moment display of what Jesus was doing. And I think as well, from a practical perspective, I like the way that as the crowd gathered, they explained how Jesus' message would have got to those people at the very back.
Yes.
Like, this is the days before microphones and, PA systems and LED screens and everything like that. It's like, how does Jesus, standing on the side of a hill, communicate to thousands of people. And so it's like his disciples have to stand among that crowd and relay the message like down the back of it. And I feel like there's a power in that, because there's like a symbolism about how we take, the teachings of Jesus and we sort of spread the word and share them. But then it also spoke to the way that these disciples had to get out of their comfort zones in order to do that, because they didn't want to be in this crowd. There was a danger potentially to being in this crowd, because it's people from all over, people with varying perspectives about Jesus and his teachings. And there was just I don't know, like I wasn't expecting that scene and those moments to feel the way they did when you're watching it actually happen.
I've been enjoying how this is another example along the way throughout The Chosen where they make me stop and think about how at different points in Jesus' life here on earth, he revealed different parts of what he's about, who he is, different levels of information. And so as you would go along then, it makes sense that the disciples, let alone others, gathered some things together, but other things they didn't. And I think often we can read the Gospels and like, how could you not work that out, etc., etc. But The Chosen does a good job of like along the way at this point of where Jesus is up to in his public ministry, it still makes sense that including his disciples may not necessarily understand exactly who he is and what he's able to do. Including when there's the vibe going around of, people are hungry, and what are we going to do? There's thousands of people. I can see why you may not necessarily think, this guy who's been doing all of these healings and we've come to believe, I think might be the Messiah. Maybe he'll be able to get us some lunch. Like I get why they may not be able to work that out at that point. I really liked the depiction of how the feeding happened, the miracle of the loaves and fish. I've thought about that at different points of like, what did that look like? Like, how did they have this magic pudding? That's an Australian reference. But how did they have this basket where the fish and the bread just kept magically coming out? Like, what did it, like, how did that work? And I thought the way they showed it on screen pretty much matched how I thought about it since I was a kid.
It never occurred to me. Like, you hear about the loaves and the fishes, and my brain was going straight to those fish. Why were they not rotten? Like, how are they? I kind of went, hang on, how did fish preservation, and maybe someone can put this in the comments if you know how this would have worked. How did fish preservation work where you
First
could literally
century sushi? Like,
exactly. Like, how was this little boy walking around with bread and fish and not getting food poisoning? Like, my brain was going to that side of things. And then also, yes, paying attention to the multiplying factor and realizing, we always get taught from this passage that the multiplication happens because of thankfulness, right? Like that commitment of whatever level of resource you have into God's hands is what makes it able to feed the 5,000, is what, makes it able to go beyond what you originally thought. But there's also this other picture of the disciples' obedience and how that plays in to what happens in this miracle. But picking up on something you said before, right, about how the disciples, they sort of didn't understand, or was Jesus really going to do this? And he can if he wants. Like Simon's line in this about if he wants to, he will, but it's kind of almost like this bitter, Jesus can do whatever he wants.
He does say that. You're right.
Like he's kind of got this, he can do it if he wants, who knows if he will kind of attitude. And I think that highlights something that was a key theme within this episode of the disciples and others are trying to work out, as we can sometimes, the pattern, or is there a pattern
is there
to Jesus' miracles? Like, what is it that gets him to, do something for people and not others? Or is it that someone's getting him to do it? Or what is the motivating factor? Like, they're looking for this kind of code to understand how Jesus operates, and they just can't seem to get it. But then constantly, again and again and again, Jesus is talking about faith. Like, he keeps saying, like they're saying it's your power leaving and it was this and it was that. And he's like, no, it's faith. And then, no, it's faith. And even in a scene that comes later with Peter, he keeps talking about faith. And it's like, for Jesus, the sort of the core of what inspires him to act, or that he looks at in people, is faith. Like, it's not about how good they are or not. It's not what religious figure they are or not. It's not, different insights. There's no pattern. Like, it's a faith conversation for Jesus, which I found like a really interesting way to discuss that within this episode.
I also like how that miracle displays, like the title of the episode, sustenance, but also the abundance in Christ. Like there's something quite excessive about what Jesus does in that miracle that I think up on screen demonstrates the bounty that's on offer for those who trust in and come to Christ, which then flows in nicely to the scene that you've hinted at that we're about to get to, of Jesus walking on the water, which I like, again, where The Chosen often remixes what goes on in the gospel in terms of order. I like these moments where they choose to do things back to back. And in the gospels, I'm sure it's like Mark or Matthew, that the feeding of the multitude does come before the walking on water. And it's a great way in a very short period of time in the gospels of displaying some of these amazing divine attributes of who Jesus is and just what he can do. What did you think of it up on screen?
This was, for me, one of the most powerful scenes of the whole Chosen series.
Was it like this one or all three? Like the whole thing?
The way it was put together, but I think it culminated, like the scene of Jesus walking on the water and the exchange with Peter. I was like, yes, they have weaved together everything in such a powerful, powerful way. I was in it. And the things that it was making me think of from my own spiritual perspective, for me, it was one of the ones, there's been so many fantastic series and scenes and everything like that. This one, I was just thought, wow, you have shown how significant it would have been. Like, yes, the backstory with Simon and Eden is something that they have built out around the scripture. But I think when you hear the story so often of Peter walking on water and they saw Jesus and they were all scared and is it a ghost? And it's like, no, it's Jesus. And then Simon Peter has to step out onto the water. For the way The Chosen present it, that comes off the back of him having his own real faith crisis, like that deep uncertainty of whether or not the Jesus who he's followed is going to do for him what he's seen him do for other people. Like, is this guy that he's followed and believed in and, you know, sort of fought for, is that guy going to deliver in the midst of Simon's real brokenness, you know? And
if he won't, why? Or if he won't in the ways that Simon and Eden would like to,
why? When you see that sort of human side of Simon's doubt and questions and pain, for him to see Jesus on the water and to say, like, it's almost a test. Like, it's like, he's like, call me out to you, you know, like sort of he wants to see Jesus do something. And for him to, in that moment, still have the sort of faith or willingness to step out of the boat, like it just meant something different to me in the way The Chosen presented it than I've ever really thought about it in scripture. Like, we don't know what was happening in Simon's life when we do, you know, encounter that moment in the Bible where he walks on water. We don't know, but I think you realize how much more it would have meant for him to do it on the back of the story that The Chosen set him up with. And then that tenderness, like, for me, there's this moment here where, like, he has faith and Jesus is saying, you know, like, just keep your eyes on me. And then it's when he starts to look at the storm and the issues that he starts to sink. And even then, like, having said, you know, that Jesus looks for faith and it's our faith that really prompts these different things to happen in our lives, in our spiritual lives as well. It's like, even when that seems to stumble or even when that's not as consistent as we might like it to be, Jesus is still there. Like, you don't think about the fact that when Simon Peter sort of lost that moment and starts to sink, like, he could have died, right? It's like, and Jesus could have gone, well, your faith like stumbled, see ya. Like, but no.
Never thought of that, like, but that's true. It's
like
true.
He could have died, right? But it's like, no, Jesus still put his hand into the water, pulled him out, and it's like, look, you may not have, in paraphrase, it's like, you may not have got this exactly right, but I'm still going to rescue you. Like, I'm still going to be here with you in your situation, even if you haven't handled it exactly right. And there's this moment where, you know, Simon's like, don't let me go. And I thought it was like this distinction between like faith and trust. Like, because Simon's saying, you know, I've believed you and I've believed you can do this and all of these sorts of things. And for us, it's like, we can believe that Jesus can, but there's this trust question of like, do you trust though that he actually will? Or that if he doesn't in the way that you expect, do you still actually trust the overarching purpose and picture of what Jesus is doing?
Yeah, it's a great image of and who your faith and trust is in. So separate to the questions about your own faith and trust, but who is it actually placed in? And the fact that it's in Jesus makes all the world of difference. I'm really glad that you've done an awesome job of summarizing the walking on water scene, because I actually wasn't that moved by it. And I really wanted to be, but I was more moved by the feeding of the multitude than this sequence. But everything that you're describing about it, I think is in there. I was actually distracted by the technical side of it, and the effects are quite good. And particularly when Jesus starts walking on the water and the way they've demonstrated that. But I got lost in, so it's being shot at night, which makes sense because it happened at night. And I really liked that they didn't have a full moon blaring so you could see everything. But I got a bit lost in, sometimes you can't actually see the faces of the actors, but I wasn't as moved as I wanted to be, because I'm totally with you. It's a great crescendo for the whole season, and it really befits particularly the Simon Eden storyline and moves nicely towards a very personal moment, but also a very telling one about who Jesus is and who you've got your faith in. All of those things were there, Laura, but it didn't really grab me like I wanted it to. So I'm glad it did for you.
Yeah, we can all kind of have our different experiences. And I think that sort of speaks to the way the different scenes are going to impact different people. And the fact that, as someone who's looking at it from a technical perspective, you're going to see the way it's put together, right? And sometimes that can be distracting. Like there were moments when particularly they're rowing and it's like you've got the waves and all of this. And like, I'm thinking, how did you actually create that within what is the set of The Chosen? How did you create that space and what did you do to do that? Because they're not shooting it in a, traditional soundstage kind of space. In some parts they can, but other parts it's like, this is a real environment. So what did you do to do it? So for sure, there is this behind the scenes aspect to these scenes you consider, but I think they did really well to get the heart of it. And also the way that they overlapped it with Eden's own journey. So she's her and Simon are kind of there in parallel to each other, and he's got to find his resolution with Jesus and faith his way, and then she's finding her resolution with Jesus and faith her way. And I liked how that overlapped, and I thought that actually spoke so beautifully to the way that two people, in their instance a husband and wife, we can experience the same trigger of grief. Like we can both face the exact same loss, but our process in dealing with it and our path to recovering from it can look totally different. And there's not necessarily something wrong with that. And we're all going to arrive at that destination of healing in a different way.
Because I've been complaining a bit during our conversations about the episodes where Jesus doesn't show up enough. There was loads of Jesus in this episode. I got stacks of Jesus, including by the end of the walking on water scene where Jesus tells the storm to be still. That got me. That was like, that is the power of who Jesus is. Like he stopped a storm, for goodness sake, let alone all these other things that went on. I really like that. And also harking back to the Psalm 77 bit from the start and then at the end, the book ending, I hadn't really noticed Psalm 77 that much, but there's some really good water imagery towards the end of that Psalm that helps to wrap it up quite neatly with why they've put it together with the walking on water sequence and this turmoil inside the psalm of wrestling with, has God left me? My enemies are rising up against me, as well as the final realization towards the end of the psalm that God still is with you, cares for you, and loves his people and can be trusted. So it's a pretty good way, I thought, of ending season 3. I was expecting this episode to like go on forever because I think it's like an hour 40, something like that. Then it wraps up at about hour 20. It's because the credits are so long. They're crediting all the people that were in the multitude sequence, which is fantastic. They're like, here's your credits. And then there's a bloopers reel at the end. Did you get to the bloopers?
I didn't get to the bloopers reel.
Stick around. There's a bloopers. I really want to know why.
I now need to go.
I thought it might be like an Easter egg, like a Marvel movie where coming up in season 4. But no, now I've kind of ruined it for you, but it's something of an Easter egg, but it's a bloopers reel.
Oh, I need to go do this. I've learned my lesson to go right to the very, very end of the credits.
It's okay. It's not like there's some funny stuff and there's some other stuff is like, yeah, sure. All right. Anyway, that's what's at the end of the credit. That's why it's an hour 40, but it only went for an hour 20. We should be wrapping up here, Laura. Thank you so much for talking to me all the way through season 3. And you mentioned behind the scenes just before, which is very fitting because as we head towards the 4th season of The Chosen, which I'm not sure yet when it's coming out, but when it does, we will be there. You are going to be behind the scenes somewhat on season 4.
Yes, and I was for parts of this season, which is why you might have seen some of the different interviews we had with some of the people from The Chosen. So I'm going to be going back to see how they have been filming season 4 and some of the storyline that's coming that season. So yes, when we return for season 4, we'll have more behind the scenes stuff to bring you as well.
Awesome. Do you reckon you actually get like on before the camera? Like not just behind the scenes, like
you want me to be an extra in the next feeding of the multitudes?
Yes, I do.
Hey, I'll try to find my way
More
in.
Than an extra, Laura. I want you to be a speaking part. You need to have one line at least by the time you get back for our next season of Following The Chosen.
Look, I'll do my best.
All right, good. Thank you very much for joining us. Keep commenting if you're on YouTube down below or wherever you're listening to us on Podcast World, hopepodcast.com.au, so we can continue the conversation, because we know you love talking about The Chosen. Season 3 is finished, Season 4 is coming, but you still love to get into every episode just like we do. So please stay in touch and keep following The Chosen.
They say the struggle is real. I say the struggle reveals how you deal with the monster that's inside you. I don't buy into the luck. I put my faith and my trust in my team, everything that we done been through.